Hello and welcome to Surveyor Says, the podcast from the National Society of Professional Surveyors. This week's episode features our panel discussion from the recent Survey and GIS Summit, hosted virtually by NSPS and URISA. Our panelists are Linda Foster from Ferber Engineering, Tripp Corbin from Davey Resource Group, Brent Jones from Esri, and I am Tim Birch from Space Co. Surveyors and GIS professionals share tools, markets, clients, and a lot more. There are many commonalities with services that surveyors and GIS professionals offer, but there are many differences as well. Questions were presented to this expert panel of both professional land surveyors and practicing GIS professionals. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast and hope you enjoy listening to this episode of Surveyor Says.
This session, we want to discuss a little bit about what we've heard and a little bit about what's happening. And we have a nice diverse group here. Tim Birch, President-elect of NSPS, who hosts the Surveyor Says podcast. And he's going to be helping us lead this discussion. He's had this same discussion with, or similar discussions with quite a few people on his podcast. Linda Foster of Ferber Engineering. She's a GISP and an LS, among other things. I think you're a drone pilot as well, with a lot of great experience. Her master's degree was actually in the parcel fabric. My name is Brent Jones. I'm from Esri. And Tripp Corbin, who has all kinds of different experiences of running his own company, doing all kinds of GIS books, GIS projects. He's written a few Learn GIS books, and now he leads GIS at Davey Resource Group. So with that, Tim, I think we let's just open this up.
You bet. Yes, like Brent said, that's a new series we've started on our Surveyor Says podcast at NSPS, and it's called What is Surveying? And to date, we've had three esteemed guests, two of them which are on this panel of Linda and Brent. And especially, it was especially nice talking to them because they have a foot in both camps. The third person was actually, we were talking on the geodesy side with Mr. Dave Doyle, retired from NGS. A lot of you know him. Most of us love him, as long as we have a Guinness in our hands. But so the question is, what is surveying? And by asking that to different people in the industry, we get different answers. And so we're trying to look at those different answers and see how we relate to each other and where we complement each other and where there's overlap, good overlap. So I guess for this panel, I'll throw it out at first. Geospatial data. I mean, should any single profession claim to own it? Tripp, what do you think?
Okay, sorry, my unmute wasn't working. So no, it's a great question, one that I think has been at the center of the relationship between both of these for as long as they have both coexisted. And I always kind of take it back to there's certain things I think we all generally agree on, right? You know, if we're determining parcel boundaries, for transfer of property or rights or things of that nature, I think there's no one would argue that that's in the realm of surveying. I think if it's for engineering type work, for actual final design, that would be in the realm of surveying. And to me, if we're ever in a situation where we have to do some sort of guarantee or warranty of accuracy and precision, I believe that should be in the realm of survey. To kind of get back to your question, does the data itself need to be segregated into ownership? Not necessarily. I think it's the use of the data or the guarantees associated with that data that do merit some segregation, if for no other reason than the basically education and training background. I started out in surveying. My dad was a surveyor and an engineer, so he drugged me out in the field as soon as I could carry a bush axe and machete. I went to school for surveying, so I understand a lot of the methodologies and ways to determine accuracy, how we can make adjustments to data to improve that information. Whereas I think a lot of folks on the GIS side don't get similar training. They don't understand what a least squares adjustment is versus a transit rule or compass rule adjustment, those kind of things. So I think there does need to be some segregation in that department. As to ownership of the data, we're all going to use. I know surveyors use GIS data, and GIS people certainly use surveying data. And it kind of gets back to some of the earlier discussions that Brett brought up and Jan brought up about the feasibility of use. What questions do we know can be answered by the data? Does the metadata exist, and those kind of things, as to which profession should own the information. But I think it's more in the use and the generation than is to overall ownership, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. That does. Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you. Having both, like I said earlier, you got feet in both camps, and you're dealing with data on both sides of this. Where do you feel like, is there any way that either profession owns any of it, or does it all go into the same big mixing pot?
I think that's a great question, Tim. And I do actually every day work on both sides of the professions, both in GIS and in land surveying. And I think, reaching back to some of the themes that were in Jan's presentation earlier, I think really at the end of the day, it comes back to, I don't know if it's so much of an ownership. I like how Tripp phrased that as a generation and use. Obviously the difference between, let's say, for instance, a registered land surveyor and a certified GIS professional, everyone I'm sure is familiar with the difference between licensing and certification. Licensing comes with a legal responsibility and liability considerations. And so that being said, there's definitely what's its purpose, what's its use, and understanding how it was generated, why it was generated, and how it should be applied, I think are critical points that need to always be considered. And I don't think that's really owned necessarily by either profession. I think it's owned by each one of us individually, and understanding that there are differences and being aware of how we're collecting, how we're processing, how we're presenting, how we're using others' data, that we're being good stewards regardless, and that we're being mindful of, is it fit for use? What was it created for? How was it generated? I like Jan's questions of, do I know? Do I know how it was created? Do I know enough about it to know how to apply it and use it in a responsible manner? So I guess that would be my take on that particular question.
Very good. And I think you hit it on the head. I mean, you're right. It is a shared use, and using the proper data for the proper application and the analysis of such, like you said, for whether it's infrastructure or for land conveyance. It just depends on where it goes. All right, Mr. Brent, I got a question for you. With technology and data collection, because of the lowering of the barrier to entry for high precision data collection, who should be using this? I mean, is there any camp either side or anybody else that should be limited to survey grade? I mean, I that's all you ever hear, survey grade data versus mapping grade data. Well, everybody can get survey grade data these days, but should that limit the GIS community?
I think we have to, I think that term is going to be survey grade, mapping grade. I think those are going to go away. I think survey grade is when we had these different GPS receivers and different types of total stations, and we understood the collection methods, and there were only a couple of them. Jan's term was, these are like life and death data sets. So when you have LiDAR on your car collecting real-time data that's, in the millimeter zone, is that survey grade? Yeah, I don't think that's a fit term. So I think there's a continuum of the quality or the precision or accuracy of data. There's several forms of accuracy. There's topological accuracy, there's positional accuracy, are the attributes correct? Is the metadata attached and validated? So I think that one of the challenges, or one of the areas where the differences initially emerged, was that accuracy was put into the hands of everyone, and it's been misused. But whether you're using a complex enterprise GIS system with single centimeter data in it, or you're plotting that on Mylar with a rapidograph, I don't think it matters. I think we have to describe what the data is, and have we memorialized that data with metadata. Surveyors will memorialize a boundary survey with a plan. Sometimes that plan gets recorded, sometimes it doesn't, but that plan represents what that data was collected for. In GIS, their systems are being built, and data is large data sets, oftentimes very accurate data sets are collected and merged and managed together. So instead of thinking of these single projects, but thinking of building these systems, and I think accuracy is in the domain of who's ever using the tools now. I think that's that unfortunately, surveyors and myself being a surveyor, that's a high degree of identity of accurate measurement. But I think that's been democratized.
Absolutely. I guess really same question to you, Tripp. Anything to add or deflect from Brent?
I think Brent's pretty much onto it. Now, I would say the added complication that we're getting is multifaceted. One is the democratization of the technologies to allow anybody to theoretically achieve high accuracy data is, what's the word? To a less, or to some degree, marginalizing what it really takes to ensure that data is truly at the accuracies that people are expecting. And I think that's part of what we have to do as a community, is make sure we're educating the users of that to understand, just because a device says it's achieved a certain level of accuracy doesn't mean that that's truly there. Janet, did a great job, I think, of illustrating some of that when he was showing the speed limit sign, and there was a lot of precision in that sensor, but there wasn't necessarily a lot of spatial accuracy. But how do we define and educate and illustrate that to the general public so they understand the limitations thereof? I mean, I remember going into a county meeting where we were delivering some ortho aerial photography, and one of the county commissioners had gone to Walmart, bought a Garmin handheld unit, and this was 15 years ago, and collected some coordinates compared to the ortho photo, and they were obviously different. And he was trying to claim that our data that we were providing in the form of the photos was wrong. And trying to then go back and explain to him, no, that his little handheld unit was not nearly as accurate or precise as the $25,000 Trimble system we had at the time to set up the control for that. It was challenging. And I think that challenge is going to continue to be out there for all of us, as more and more of this information is being generated by our cars, by our smartphones, you name it, in being able to show the limitations there, and to show that why we need things like surveyors that are trained in being able to verify accuracy and precision and calculate error matrix with those and those kind of things. So I think that's a big challenge we're all facing. As well as, and it's been brought up in a couple of comments, I think here in the chat, is can we keep the legislation? I mean, and that's in essence really what defines the boundary between surveying and GIS is the laws for professional surveying. Can they keep up with the changes of technology? If not, how do we facilitate that so that they are reasonable? The laws out there that are defining that and so on. So.
Oh, exactly. Well, and one thing I guess I would add as far as the data collection methods, and this is, and I know I'm preaching to the choir to everybody in this conference. To me, it's the people that are going out spending their $700 to $1,500 on their UAV, another $3,000 on photogrammetry software, and now saying that they can go out and fly sites for construction, analyzation for volumes, for various things. Yeah, once again, it's the data may be very, very, very precise, but how accurate is it? Can you tie that to other things? So we've got to be careful. While there is a lot of ways to collect very accurate data, and I agree with Brent that the survey grade, mapping grade, that whole thing is going to go away because of the ability. I'm still surprised. It was just a couple of years ago that one of the Chinese phone manufacturers came out with a dual frequency GPS phone, and I'm surprised that more of the manufacturers have not jumped on board of that just yet. I mean, they've now obviously, like Brent said, thrown LiDAR in the iPhones. We're going to see dual frequencies in these phones on a regular basis very soon, and you're going to put that in the hands of realtors and other people that are going to say, I can measure just as close as you. I can position just as close as the surveyor can. So we've got to be careful with that.
Yeah, Tim, I had a professor
Tim,
who said, go ahead, Linda.
Oh, no, I'm watching the chat here, and I wanted to there's some great conversation going on here
Yes.
in our chat window. I so wish we were all sitting in the same room together and we would have a very, very great discussion. I can just see it. But one of the things that, what just came up here most recently was educating the public and having them understand or not understand what's being used and what the possibilities are. But let's roll back and look at our chat window here. We have some great discussion about education.
Mm-hmm.
So education in the GIS arena and education in the land surveying arena. I think there's still arguably some gaps in both in introducing each other to the other profession and helping open that door and helping each profession better understand what their counterparts are doing and what the foundation of the profession really is. And I think that's at the core of why this group brought the summit back to light, because this is a conversation that needs to be had. And I know, Tim, you and I have had some great discussions about the educational piece of it. And maybe you can speak a little bit to that as far as does there need to be more emphasis on GIS in the surveying curriculums and vice versa?
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, Brent, you got a thought? You want to jump in here?
Well, I think it's really important. There is a fundamental difference, and it has nothing to do with measurement. It has nothing to do with spatial analysis or making maps. But look, land surveyors are granted the authority by the states to issue legal opinions, and those legal opinions they're limited. But a measurement is a legal opinion. A boundary survey is a surveyor's opinion of where that boundary is. Boundaries can only be fixed by the court. When I was a young student, 30 some years ago, the chairman of the department had to go testify as an expert witness. And when it was all exciting, we're young surveying students, this is really exciting. And it was testifying on the size of a piece of property. And, as a student, you think like, why is that? Why isn't there an answer? And there's not, okay, because all measurements have error. And when he got back from court, he said, we settled out of court. So on these things that we consider, you were talking about these measurements of how they're so important. The determination of a piece of property was the size was determined, was settled on a handshake outside the court. So it's really important to remember that the measurements, when they're done by a surveyor and used in construction or in determining a boundary or opinion of boundary, or in that process, it's a different thing than going out and locating property corners, monuments, fire hydrants, topological features. Regardless of the accuracy, they're different functions. The data is collected for different uses, and the accuracy is independent.
Right. No, yeah, I completely agree that, well, and I guess that's going to bring kind of one of my next questions up for all three of you. Licensed surveyor versus a GISP, and not necessarily versus battling out in the ring. It's knowledge base. How do they compare in knowledge in what they're charged with by their license or charged with their certification? Linda, you're both. Tell me, what do you think?
Well, I think that's a great question, and they're really completely different in my experience as far as, the types of topics that are taught. I can think of maybe two courses in my background that really there was a tremendous amount of crossover, and it was relevant and very similar in both worlds, if you will, that I've trained in and practiced in. But aside from that, there's a tremendous amount of difference, to be perfectly honest, and also in kind of the process and means by which you gain licensure as a professional land surveyor, and also the process in which you gain certification as a GISP. There's some very stark differences. Now, both require an extraordinary amount of training and knowledge and experience, and I think that's a very common thread. But as far as similarities in, perhaps content and that type of a thing, very different as well.
Sure. Tripp, what do you think? What does each side bring to the table that really is necessary for licensing of surveying versus certification of a GISP?
No, it's a great question. I think in general terms, GIS and the GISP is much more dispersed in the knowledge areas. In GIS, not only are we having to understand the geospatial side of things, but we're also supposed to get into some of the IT level with servers, server architecture, database administration, database design, developing and serving of web services, just to name a few. So I think within the GIS side of things, we have that more dispersed knowledge area where I think generally surveying is much more focused on the spatial side, but not just with spatial accuracy, but also with legal issues that Brent was talking about, having to issue opinions on boundaries, understanding how the law impacts that, and things of that nature that most GIS folks are not trained in. So, and because of that, where each state has differing laws on legal ownership of property, legal boundary determinations, and things of that nature. I think that's really why surveyors have to be licensed, and they have to be licensed in each state. We've talked a lot or several times mentioned the public land system. Well, I live here in Georgia. We don't have the public land system. We have a head right system and a land lottery system. So we have two different property systems here that a surveyor would have to understand in order to properly render some legal opinions on where boundaries or locations would be at in that. That's why we have licensed surveyors here in Georgia being able to understand that. Whereas a GIS person doesn't necessarily have to understand all that. Maybe they don't deal with cadastral data at all. Maybe they're dealing with disease type data or voting district data or something of those nature that wouldn't require that. So, that's where I think the certification side is better suited to GIS because of that dispersed knowledge requirement, as well as the fact that we're going to not always be dealing with legal issues or cadastral data.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
it-
Let me
go ahead,
point
Brent.
out to the listeners. Not everyone knows how someone becomes a licensed surveyor. There's essentially an experience component, and 2 or 3 or 4 different tests depending on where you live. There's a national exam, which is technical competence. You could probably compare that to a GISP style of exam. Then there is a law exam that covers that particular state laws. Then there's a regional type, whether it's a public land survey system or New England states, and some other regions have these regional tests. And then sometimes there's a practicum where you have to do some work. And then there's an experience component. And here's the challenge of the land surveying profession is that that experience component in those tests are all about, the majority of it's about boundary. And how you make an opinion of boundary, how you find evidence in the written word, in the written record, locate evidence on the ground, and apply the law from the words to the physical features found, and try to interpret what was meant to happen from the document. And the law has very specific guidelines of what words means and how to apply the rules of evidence. The challenge we have here is that that's a very, very specific part of surveying. And what's happening in the surveying field is all these new measurement technologies, all these data collection technologies, LiDAR, in particular, all these imagery techniques, GPS, all these things are collecting data that is not necessarily used for boundary, but the technology behind all those high precision, high accuracy data collection tools are part of it falls under surveyors, because in order to, surveyors by statute are the only profession that can actually give an opinion or attest to the accuracy of a measurement. So you have this dichotomy that's taking place of these massive measurement tools are growing, but this very small slice of cadastral surveying where all those things need to be filtered through. And I think that's where the system that's where the rub takes place.
Oh, exactly. And I tell you what, watching the comments in the chat just go through, I want to jump back to those, but something I wanted to mention, and this is something that the GIS side maybe isn't quite aware of, the difficulties in surveying. I'm seeing more and more of surveyors, and I'll use the air quotes, that get on social media and will complain about surveying and the lack of being able to be licensed because they didn't go to school, didn't get their 4-year bachelor's degree, what have you, and that there's so much emphasis put on licensure for a surveyor on land and on statute and on law that it's the complaint is, I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread in construction staking. I should be a licensed land surveyor, and they miss the point that it's not just that one sliver of what the surveying is allowing us to do. So, kind of going back to what Tripp said about all of the different components of GIS, it's similar, that, we have our own little battles within the surveying world on what needs to be licensed and what could be certified. So, and I want to go back a little bit in the comments, back to Jackie Dillon for a second. Yes, you're on to NSPS and most surveyors. We are here trying to convince more GISPs to come over to the good side for PLSs. So,
hey, I didn't know that's what this was about. Okay,
yes,
I know there's a labor shortage, but I didn't know that's what the battleground was for.
No, absolutely not. Bottom line is that we've got to be able to stay open to all of this. So, but anybody that wants to come on over to the PLS side, let us help you. We'll get that figured out. But next question I have is the actual geospatial data. Okay, analysis versus boundary and topographic data. What's the difference there?
Oh, that's simple. Boundary is applying the law to the data that you collect in the field and the survey record, the written record, the conveyance documents.
But what about topographic data and existing infrastructure information?
That's mapping. That's mapping, right? You're collecting features on the ground. That's the part that used to require specialty tools and special knowledge, and that has been in my opening comments. I see, the ease and convenience of the ability to use new technology has made those things just easy to use, and it comes back to that accuracy thing, right? Well, how accurate do you want to locate that fire hydrant? Just depends on how much you want.
So
to
I would jump in there.
Yeah.
I would jump in there with a caveat to that, Brent, and that would be in engineering applications or construction applications of topographic data. And it circles right back around to the whole liability conversation. If we're talking about topographic mapping and support of engineering design, then I think we're back in the arena of licensing and liability, and same for if your activities are supporting construction, for instance, if you want to consider some of those activities topographic in nature, I think it kind of can circle back that direction too.
I could not agree more with that. It depends on the use. I can locate that utility pole, to a few centimeters. And if it's for asset management or trying to figure out how much wire you need from pole to pole, no problem. But if I'm going to put backhoe teeth in the ground, it's a little different.
Well, I agree completely with what y'all are saying, but here a little devil's advocate, if you will, right? If we're talking about engineering design, that has to be signed off on by a licensed professional engineer. If that engineer is willing to take the liability of using data that hasn't been signed off on or stamped by a surveyor, should they be allowed to do that? Could they use GIS data at that point?
Well, I don't like the term GIS data.
statute.
It's data.
Well,
where did the data come from?
Data that wasn't signed off on, and whether we call it GIS data, geospatial data, whatever. I mean, the point comes is, isn't it the responsibility of the engineer to make that call? And like I said, I'm agreeing with y'all in general terms that should generally be done by a surveyor, but because of the technology changes we have coming down, the capabilities of, in general terms of anybody being able to get high accuracy data, should that stipulation still exist, that data that's used for engineering purposes be done by a licensed surveyor, or should we leave that to the discretion of the PE involved?
And I would say that already is covered generally, in my experience, at least in several states that I'm familiar with the statute. Quite often that's spelled out in the state law, whether or not a registered land surveyor is required to be the responsible party to support engineering surveys, or if it can be done under the purview of the licensed engineer. So that, I think, kind of gets into the weeds again of, the statutes and how that gets dictated.
There's a little buyer beware there as well. In boundary, when you convey property, generally you have an abstract of title done, and there's title insurance, which protects the attorney, and it protects the homeowner it protects the borrower. It protects the homeowner, or protects the lender. And it protects the borrower if you choose to add that policy. With boundary, there's no boundary insurance, and boundary insurance ends up actually being the liability insurance of the surveyor. So there's a little bit of buyer beware there. So I think that's one of the things that's not well understood in the public, is if you have a boundary survey done and you build that garage and your surveyor doesn't have liability insurance, you're probably stuck. If they have liability insurance, you're probably in okay shape. So it's that legal world that surveyors work in the construction and boundary side of things, and that's the world that most GIS practitioners don't work in.
Right. Well, something else I want to throw into this mix right here and now. with the continuing emergence of remote sensing and more sensors, LiDAR, all of this stuff that's going on, and the push towards, especially in municipal areas, towards digital twins. Of the three of you, do you see issues going forward with municipalities, governmental agencies collecting this information, however they're doing it, and putting together these digital models, these digital twins, and then somewhere in the end, something gets sifted out as far as a boundary or ownership issues? I mean, how do we head that off at the pass before we get there, before somebody is now taking this digital twin and doing some statistical analysis or what have you, and we have legal issues on the ground? Linda, you got anything on that?
Yes, we see a lot of this happening, and overall, I think this trend is positive. I think it's a great thing. We're in a rapidly building world right now. We have a lot of activity, a lot of projects. The more data and information that can be collected and gathered and used for good decision making, which I would say is where, one level of data that we're talking about here in this panel is, I would say, overarching planning level, decision-making level, analytical level data, and it comes down to good decision-making. But I think the core of what you're asking here comes back around again to how is it used? There's all kinds of mechanisms and means and ways to go get that data, but at the end of the day, is it being used in the appropriate manner it was intended for, collected for? A municipality goes out and gathers a whole bunch of LiDAR data and it's not well controlled, and it's, we'll say quote unquote mapping grade, which I know some of us, including myself, cringe when we use that label, but use it for sake of conversation. And then all of a sudden, there's boundary questions that start coming up. Now the lines are blurring, and is there someone with the correct background to interpret and offer those opinions when, let's say, a boundary situation comes up?
Well, obviously, it really comes down to a good, solid cadastral layer, which may or may not be formalized within the system itself. But Tripp, what do you think about going forward with digital twins and the liabilities that lie ahead with these big data sets?
We have inherent issues with a lot of the data used in municipalities anyway, regardless of how full featured they may or may not be. I think that liability already exists. People are already using data in unintended ways. I think that's going to continue to increase, especially as we get into integration with BIM. And that's becoming more and more. Jan showed some of the 3D models he had been doing in the DC area. So I think that liability is going to increase. I guess the issue, one of the things we have to address is a lot of the licensing laws exempt government employees from the need for having a license.
Yes. Yeah.
And so does that offer some protection to the government, or does it open them up to more liability because they don't have the license? And I guess that's some of the questions we need to ask. And then if we're a consultant working with those entities, is our licensing and or insurance protecting them to some extent or not? And I don't know that we've had any direct challenges to some of that, but we do see where issues between jurisdictional data have caused problems, and why we see the new next gen 911 requirements coming out is because we have had life and death issues literally happen because two jurisdictions had disagreeing GIS data.
Right.
So that, it's really kind of an open can of worms right now.
Brent, what do you have to say about the digital twin phenomenon revolution?
Well, it's just data. Okay. it's just more data. What happens when I bring my iPhone in and I update that data set? I think the liveliness or the currentness in how we update data, I think that's going to radically change. So I think we're going to be looking at more dynamic data than a CAD file that's been sitting around for 10 years. I think I'm going to give a teaser out there on Nancy Von Meyer's keynote tomorrow. There's when we make decisions, there are high consequence decisions and low consequence decisions. And there are decisions that are reversible and decisions that are irreversible. If I make a low consequence reversible decision, I'll use whatever data I can get my hands on. And if I'm planning the route of a utility line, I'll just grab anything I can get. I'll get soils. It's, the national soils maps. I'll get parcel maps from cities and counties. I'll just mung all this data together and then plan out what I need to do. And as we go down that funnel, and this is the same with the digital twin, as we go down that funnel, I want to put in, I want to install some specific plumbing. Well, I'm probably going to go in and do a little validation or verification of that data. And I think that's kind of, we have these data sets for managing and planning and use, but when we go to actually physically change things, I think we go to another level of validation, because the consequence of the decision is so much greater if you make a mistake.
Exactly. All right. Well, we're winding this thing down. We're into the last 5 minutes or so. I do want to throw out, Raphael had a question out there about some municipalities would have benefits if they requested coordinates on plats and easements. Brent, what would you say if more municipalities required digital submissions? I mean, that there's, and I'm trying to remember what, I don't know, states or areas or whatever in Australia has went to a digital requirement now.
Sure.
What would you think about that?
Yeah, there's coordinated cadasters out there. Mostly that's a legal thing. And when it comes down to coordinates, they're generally calculated from measurements, whether that measurement is done with a GPS or a total station. So I actually personally don't look at coordinates any differently than I do really good collected data. However, that said, if you're requiring state plane coordinates on something, that raises the bar on the capabilities of the submitter. So if you say, oh, I want these in, if you want all this metadata around that point, yeah, that continues to raise the bar. I think when if let's just say a survey plat, for example, that you submit to the city for approval, if you put the coordinates on there, that's going to help whoever's managing the GIS a lot better to get that information in there, and that's going to improve the quality of the GIS. It's going to make the GIS more reliable. So I think it's a nice thing to do, but there's many ways to get that same data into the system without coordinates.
Sure. Tripp, what do you think about that?
There's a lot of places throughout Georgia and elsewhere that I work that do require digital data submission standards or digital data submission of as-built and plats and whatnot. As Brent said, there's a lot of benefits to that. I think there's a couple of caveats that we have to be cognizant of. First is, I know here in Georgia, there are still surveyors and even engineers that hand draw stuff. And by law, you can't prevent a licensed professional from practicing their profession within, the proper guidelines. So often you have to allow for some sort of hand drawn caveat or submission there. The other part to that is we talked about in the earlier presentations, is that, coordinates change. And just assigning coordinates to, say, property corners, building corners, or those things, if people are not smart or not educated, I don't want to say smart, educated enough to understand that coordinate was assigned at an epoch, as they were talking about earlier, that's 10 years later, that's not going to have the same value because of the land moving right? So we have to be aware and make sure that we are incorporating that within to those requirements and part of that understanding, because the general public is not going to get that.
Sure. Linda, wrap us up there.
Absolutely. I think that's somewhat of a slippery slope. I think there's definitely some potential benefit there, but the danger is also in the metadata. Quite frankly, we may be talking about two different things here. Is this a paper plat submittal that has coordinates recorded, or versus a digital submittal? Either way, metadata is absolutely critical, because those coordinates don't mean anything unless we know their identity and we know what they mean. Otherwise, to me, it's almost more dangerous to have that included than to just leave it off.
Right. Well, we've pretty much elapsed all of our usable time here. And I know this session could go for probably a couple more hours, to be honest with you. I wouldn't mind it, but probably everybody else listening would. Linda, any parting thoughts on how we bring GIS and surveying closer together?
I'm just so excited that we're all here today and we are at the table and having these conversations, because we're going to be doing more and more and more of this into the future. And I think that awareness is the first step. That's getting each of our professions and each one of us more educated, more aware, and more introduced, if you will, to what each profession is doing and how we're doing it and how we complement each other and how we can work together. Because I think Jan hit the nail on the head. It takes all of us, and we're in this together, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And so the sooner that we can come together, help each other out, learn what each other does, we'll be so much stronger because of it.
Exactly. Tripp, what do you think? Parting shots?
Sure. I remember when I first got into GIS and was talking to some of my surveyor buddies, and they were all joking around about how GIS stands for, get it surveyed. There's an increasing amount of communication going on between our two professions, and I think that's wonderful. We support and complement each other. That I don't think there's really or should be any conflict there. It's just a matter of us getting down to the table and really understanding the strengths and weaknesses of what each of us can bring to the table and how we can really foster each other's professions and just supporting the overall health, safety, and welfare of the public. So, yeah.
Exactly. Well, Brent, we'll let you have your final shots and then turn the baton back over to you as master of ceremonies today.
Okay.
Thank you all for participating today, and thanks for all of the great comments in the chat. We're definitely going to have Wendy grab all of these and really take a look at them. And if there's questions about what's more about what we're talking about here, fire us notes, fire us suggestions, and together we keep this dialogue open. We're going to make it so much better. So with that, Brent, thank you, and take it away.
Well, I think GIS, and I was hoping nobody would use that title, get it surveyed. A friend of mine in New England, in Boston, actually one day told me it means guaranteed income stream. And I think there's so much opportunity for surveyors in GIS. I think it's a time now that the technology supports all the things surveyors used to need that was perceived that GIS couldn't. GIS is a lot easier to use now, and it's used by almost all of our common customers and clients, whether you're a GIS practitioner or you're a surveyor. We're serving common clients. And I think there's just a wealth of opportunity. So that's how I'd like to close it. And I'd like to thank Tim, and I will shamelessly plug Surveyor Says podcast, because I think it's pretty good. There's some good stuff in there. If you're not subscribed into it,
I was going to ask you if we could do it. Good, just give it a quick plug, because like I said, because of especially the two members here, Linda and Brent, that were on, those were two fantastic conversations because of the guests, and a lot more great insight to having both feet in each camp. Surveyor Says, just search on that. You can go through nsps.us.com. Take a listen. Like I said, they were both great interviews, and Dave Doyle as well, amongst everything else. So thanks again, Brent.
Yeah, and that's another area where there's a lot of comments in there, and hopefully we can capture these comments afterwards and try to put together some more thoughtful work on this. Because we do want to keep the conversation going, and again, feedback on this session, feedback on the GIS and Survey Summit as a whole to help us guide further. And with that, thanks again, Tim and Tripp and Linda. Thank you personally. I know all these guys personally, so it's kind of we all have common and differing views. So it's nice to get together and chat and discuss those.
You've been listening to the Surveyor Says podcast, brought to you by the National Society of Professional Surveyors. If you have any questions about today's episode or any other topic, please email us at info@nsps.us.com, and we are here to help. Visit our website, nsps.us.com, to learn more about our association, the programs we administer and support, our sustaining members, and information about future episodes of Surveyor Says. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Spotify, as well as our podcast host, Podbean. And remember, it's a great day to be a surveyor.